everybody, it's me, Angela Walters from quiltingismytherapy.com, and welcome to the second video in the Help How Do I Quilt It Free Motion Challenge Quilting Along video series. Last week we learned some machine quilting design ideas for chevron shaped blocks, and in this video I'm going to share some of my favorite quilting designs for snowball blocks. I'm going to demonstrate how to quilt them on a sewing machine and a long arm, and tell you how you can get free quilting diagrams. So let's get to it. A snowball quilt block is a square quilt block with triangles in the corner that gives you a nice round focused center part. There are a couple things that I take into consideration when picking out designs for snowball blocks. First up, the size. Snowball blocks can be very small or very large, and the designs that I might pick are dependent on the size of that block. For instance, a larger snowball block will need a bigger design that might not fit in a smaller one. And secondly, like most quilt blocks, I take into consideration the fabric it's pieced with. If that center portion of the snowball block is a bright, bold, beautiful print, I'm probably going to opt for something a little bit easier and quicker in that area, since you're not going to see the quilting anyway. But if it's a tonal or solid fabric, well, that's when I like to have fun with the quilting because it's really going to shine. In this video, I've picked designs that are going to fit a wide range of snowball blocks as well as a range of skill levels. So let's talk about that first design. The first quilting design that I'm going to show you that works great in snowball blocks is a wavy swirl. This design is perfect because it's easy to quilt and it adds a lovely texture to your block. I especially love using this design when I'm working on blocks with busy fabrics. Since you're not going to see the quilting anyway, I want to use something quick and easy to quilt. And this wavy swirl design adds just the right amount of wavy texture. Starting from one corner, I'm going to begin quilting a wavy line that curls around the edge of that block. Think of it like a swirl, but quilted wavy. Once I make my way around the whole block, I'm going to continue along the inside, again, kind of swirling into the center. But to add a little bit of texture or a little bit of a different look to the design, at a random point, I'm going to run into the previously quilted wavy line and then bounce back out. And you can add as many of these little touching points as you'd like. As I start adding those lines and adding those little points, it's going to give the look of an abstract type of flower. And I'm going to keep on going until I reach the center of my block. There's no rule that says how wavy your line has to be, just give it a little bit of movement, keeping it somewhat close to the edge. You can use this design in smaller snowball blocks or even larger snowball blocks, just by adding more and more rings to your echo. I'm using a contrasting thread so you can really see what I'm doing, but if I were actually quilting this on a block, I'd use a thread color that blends in so that you would see that beautiful texture. If you want a similar type design without all the wavy lines, you can quilt just a big swirl that fills in that block. I will admit one of the drawbacks to this design is that it ends in the center of the block, so I'm going to have to tie off and start a new line of quilting. But since it's so fast and easy to quilt, I don't think it's that big of a deal. One of my favorite quilting tricks is to use the quilting to make a new shape to fill in, and in this design we're going to do just that. Technically, the center of our snowball block is an octagon, but we can use the quilting to turn it into a square to really make the center of that shine. This design works in blocks of all sizes and is a perfect way to let individual blocks shine. And what I love is you can make this design as complex or as easy as you like, just depending on what you feel like doing. I'm going to start on the midpoint of one of the sides of my snowball and quilt a straight line across to the midpoint of the next side. If you wanted to, you could mark a reference line or just kind of eyeball it, either way is fine. And then another line to the midpoint of the next side, and then continuing on until I reach my starting point. I'm just using the quilting to create the shape I want to quilt. And now that I have my square area, I can fill that in with any design I want. I could quilt a continuous curve design or add some kind of filler, but for this, I'm going to add a little bit of a fancier look by quilting an echo line inside that square. So from my starting point, I'm going to quilt a line about a ½ inch or so. Using this line allows me to get into the inside of my block so that I can add that echo line. But if I have one line here, I want to make sure I do it on all the other sides so that it looks intentional. So I'm going to echo the side of that square, stopping about a ½ inch away from that other corner. And then I'm going to quilt a line that goes out and directly back. And I'm going to keep doing that until I return back to my starting point. And I'm using a ruler to help me keep these lines kind of straight, but you could also freehand this, of course. And then my last line is going to come right into my starting point. I just love how it gives it that framed, kind of echoed look. From this point, I could either fill in the inside with the design, or I could just travel right back on out and continue on. Since I want to add a little bit of cool detail in that area, I'm just going to quilt some swirls that fill it in and then come back to my starting point. This design works best in bigger blocks, so I have a little bit more room to fill on the inside. And since it takes a little bit longer for this design to come together, I'm going to make sure and use it in blocks that are pieced with tonal or solid fabrics, so you can actually see the quilting when I'm done. And then once that center is filled in, I can backtrack along that line, get to the edge of my block, and then continue on with my quilting. Experiment with this design and see what kind of variations you can come up with. It's no secret that I love quilting feathers, so it probably comes as no surprise that I'm going to use feathers in one of these designs. For this particular option, we're going to quilt a feather that wraps around a swirl and fills in that beautiful snowball block. It works in blocks of all sizes, and it's a great way to practice the feather design without committing to quilting it over the whole quilt. Starting from any corner, I'm going to quilt a big swirl inside that snowball block. Try to leave about a ½ inch or so in between those lines because I need room to add my petals, working my way back out until you have something like this. This swirl is going to act as a spine of my feather, and I'm going to work my way back out of that block by quilting the petals of that feather. These petals are kind of like half-heart shapes, quilting a line that curves out to fill in that area and then comes back into that swirl to look like it's merging into it. It's going to give me room to quilt my next petal and just looks really nice. I'm trying to quilt those petals so they extend out into the swirl or the edge of the block and filling in that space just as much as possible. That means that some of your petals might be bigger than others, and that's totally fine. And I'm going to keep quilting those petals, working my way around the swirl until I get back to my starting point. I love to use this in snowball blocks where I love to draw attention to that center area and really make it shine. I just love how the feather adds an elegant, beautiful look, and it fills in that space so perfectly. And like I said in the last video, if you're struggling with those feather designs, I have a whole video series that goes over those in detail, so you can check that out. And there's my beautiful swirly feather. Now the most important thing here is I want to make sure that that feather fills in the block as much as possible. Now of course we will have gaps in some areas, but as long as those gaps are smaller than the petals themselves, it's going to look lovely. Now let's see what it looks like to quilt the same design on a Longarm quilting machine. Of course, the feather goes together the same way. I'm still going to start with my swirl, then quilt my petals, working my way back out. Don't be afraid to really extend those petals out into the area. I know I've already said it, but I'd rather have differently shaped petals than big gaps. I think the hardest thing about quilting this design on a Longarm is controlling the movement of the machine. Try not to hold on to the handle too hard. Instead, use a light grip and kind of flow with the machine. I promise, it doesn't take that long for the design to click. If the idea of quilting feathers is a little scary or if it's tripping you up, there is a different variation you can do, where we quilt a flower instead of a feather. It looks pretty similar, but it might be just a little bit easier. It's still going to start out the same, quilting that swirl that works its way towards the center, leaving about a ½ inch or an inch in between those lines. But instead of quilting that half-heart shape, I'm just going to quilt a line that arcs out and back. The result's going to look more like a flower instead of a feather, but it's still going to look beautiful. So I'm not worrying about the lines looking like they're merging into the spine. Instead, I'm just quilting those arcs and filling in that area until I get back to the starting point. And some of your petals might be bigger, some might be smaller. That's totally fine. Again, I just want to make sure that area is filled in as completely as possible. Now, while we're learning this design in a snowball block, it actually works in squares and circle blocks as well. So it's definitely a versatile design that you can use in a lot of different ways. And when we're done, we have a design that looks very similar to that feather, just slightly different, but you might find it a little bit easier to quilt. So far, we've been working with snowballs that are kind of standalone, kind of all by themselves. But every once in a while, you'll get blocks that are grouped together to make a bigger shape, such as this area here. For this next design, I'm going to use dot-to-dot quilting, but quilt it in such a way that it really pulls the blocks together. And I'm going to show you how to do that on a Longarm. I'm going to quilt the design so that it extends from the center and fills in each of the snowball blocks. So starting from the outer corner, I'm going to quilt a line to the midpoint of the center block. Then I'll quilt another line out towards the outer corners, stopping about a ½ inch or so away from the edge. Then I'll echo the top edge and return back to my starting point. Once that center's done, I'm going to do the same on both sides to fill in the area. By quilting a line that goes out, echoes the side, and returns back to the starting point. Depending on the size of the block, you can add more or less wedges. I'm going to do the same on the other side while remembering to leave room to quilt on out to the other side. Since I'm quilting this on a Longarm quilting machine, I'm definitely using a ruler to help me quilt all those diagonal lines. If you're quilting this on a sewing machine, you can use a ruler or freehand them. Once the first block's finished, I'm going to use that line to transition to the next block, quilting a line to the outer corner, and then on to the midpoint of the next side of the center block and repeat. This design might look complex, but really it's just the same steps over and over. If If you're not sure where to go next, just pause and mark out the next couple of steps until you're back on track. And just as we did before, once the section's complete, I'm going to use the quilting to transition to the next side and do the same. This design is really going to draw the eye to the center of the block, since that's where all the lines are pointing. So be sure to use this in focal blocks or ones that you really want to show off. To make this design even more efficient, you can quilt the center block before adding the very last line. I'm going to stitch around the edges and add some continuous curve, then return to the starting point. And then once that's done, I'll quilt a straight line to the outer corner and finish the design. I love how I'm able to quilt the whole design to group the blocks together without a lot of starts and stops. You can use this same technique with other designs as well. You just need a way to transition from side to side. One part of the design needs to help you move on, and the second part needs to fill the block while returning back to your starting point. In this example, I'm using curved lines to create that same design, quilting a curved line to the center, out to the edge and back, and moving on. I'm using my smiley ruler to help me quilt the bigger curves of this design, but of course you could freehand it or experiment with this idea and see what variations you can come up with. Now, there are so many different ways that you can quilt snowball blocks. Most designs that work in squares or circle designs will work perfectly in those blocks. You can quilt an all-over design in that area, or you can even use the quilting to break that snowball up into different shapes. Starting from one corner of my snowball, I'm going to quilt a straight line to the opposite corner, travel to the next one, and repeat. And what it's going to do is break up that snowball into 4 smaller shapes. And now that I have that broken up into smaller pieces, I can fill in those areas with different designs. Maybe a little continuous curve, and then in the smaller pieces, maybe some wishbones that just go from one side to the other. This is definitely something I would do in a larger block, since it takes that bigger area and breaks it down into more manageable pieces. And this is kind of like a choose your own adventure. You can fill in those areas with any design you'd like. There you can see a totally unique design that's created by combining other designs. There's so many different options for quilting these blocks, but I'm sure you're going to find the ones that you love. Whether you go for something elegant like a feather or add a beautiful texture with a wavy swirl, it's going to look great. Now it's your turn. If you're quilting along with me on the custom panel I designed for the challenge, fill in the areas highlighted in red with the designs of your choice. You can use the designs we've learned in this video or come up with your own designs that are perfect for the snowball blocks. And as always, I've put together free quilting diagrams, so be sure to click the link in the description box to take advantage of that. And I'll be back soon with another video in the Help How Do I Quilt It series. Until then, everyone, happy quilting.